My name is Clara Whitmore. On the coldest day of the year, I found myself standing on my own porch, shivering in the wind with nothing but a small bag in my hand. The door behind me had slammed shut, the sound echoing like a final verdict. My husband and my mother-in-law were on the other side, warm, safe, and utterly done with me. Trust me, you'll regret skipping this story. So before you sit back and listen, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Grace's Truth. Now get in the mood to listen to this story because it might be the ultimate sweet revenge. The snow had been falling since dawn, thick and relentless, muting the sounds of the neighborhood. My breath came out in small clouds, each one quickly carried away by the wind. I stared at the door for a moment as if by sheer will I could make it open again. But I knew better. The click of the lock had been sharp, deliberate, a sound that told me I was no longer welcome in my own home. It's strange the things you notice in moments like that. The way the brass doorknob gleamed faintly in the gray light. The muffled sound of a TV from inside. The scent of the roast my mother-in-law had been cooking. My life, my marriage was still in there. I just wasn't part of it anymore. The weight of my bag dug into my palm. I hadn't had time to pack properly. I'd been given 10 minutes to collect my essentials. Essentials apparently didn't include my winter boots or the quilt my grandmother had made for me. My mother-in-law had stood in the doorway of my bedroom the whole time, arms crossed, watching me choose what little I could take. My husband had lingered in the hallway, looking anywhere but at me. "You'll be fine," she'd said, her voice brisk, almost cheerful. "It's just for a while. Maybe you'll think about how to be a better wife." I'd bitten my tongue so hard I tasted blood. The truth. This wasn't sudden. It had been building for months, maybe years, but I'd been too stubborn or too hopeful to admit it. My husband Michael had once been warm to me, protective even. But after his mother moved in with us temporarily 2 years ago, the warmth had started to fade. Her presence filled every corner of the house, her opinion slid into every conversation, and somehow, I became the enemy. At first it was little things. She'd sigh loudly if I cooked something she didn't like. She'd rearrange the kitchen when I wasn't looking. She'd accidentally wash Michael's clothes separately from mine because men's things shouldn't mix. Michael would chuckle, tell me not to take it so seriously. But over time, her small intrusions grew bolder. And Michael stopped laughing with me. He started laughing at me. This morning had been the breaking point. I'd come downstairs to find her sitting at the table with a pile of my mail spread out in front of her. When I asked what she was doing, she told me she was checking to see if I was hiding bills from Michael. My voice had been sharp, too sharp, I suppose, because Michael appeared almost instantly, as if he'd been waiting for a reason. "What's going on?" he'd asked. "She's hiding things from you." His mother had said, eyes narrowed at me like she'd caught me pocketing silverware. I told him it wasn't true. I told him she was out of line. But it didn't matter. He didn't look at me like a wife anymore. He looked at me like a problem that needed solving. The argument escalated. I remember my voice cracking, my hands shaking. I remember saying, "You're choosing her over me." And I remember the way he didn't deny it. "Maybe you should leave for a while," he'd said finally, his tone infuriatingly calm. "Cool off. Think about things." His mother was smiling faintly, not with kindness, but with satisfaction. And now here I was, standing in the snow with no place to go. The wind picked up, cutting through my coat, making my teeth chatter. My phone felt like a block of ice in my pocket. I thought about calling my sister, but she lived 3 states away and had her own family to worry about. I thought about calling a friend, but most of them were people I'd met through Michael, and I knew where their loyalties would lie. I walked to the edge of the driveway, my boots crunching in the snow. The street was quiet, just the occasional car passing by, their tires hissing against the slush. Each step away from the house felt heavier than the last, not because of the snow, but because it felt like I was walking away from years of my life without any idea where I was going. Some part of me kept hoping I'd hear the door open, that Michael would call out, tell me to come back inside. but that hope was foolish. Even if he did, I wasn't sure I'd turn around. I made it to the corner before my hands went numb. I ducked into a small bus shelter, its cracked plexiglass walls offering little protection from the cold. My breath fogged the air in front of me as I pulled my phone out again, scrolling through my contacts. I didn't know it then, but this moment, sitting in the freezing wind feeling like the world had decided I was disposable, would be the one that changed everything. Not because someone was going to swoop in and rescue me, but because I was going to have to figure out how to rescue myself. And that I thought grimly was something my husband and mother-in-law never expected. The wind that day was merciless, but it wasn't nearly as cruel as the months that had led me to that bus shelter. Looking back, it didn't happen all at once. People like to imagine that betrayal is a single moment, a knife to the back, a door slammed in your face, but for me, it was a slow drip. Each drop felt insignificant at first, but over time it filled the space between Michael and me until there was no us left. It started subtly right after his mother, Evelyn, moved in. She'd had a minor fall, nothing catastrophic, but enough to make Michael insist she stay with us until she got back on her feet. That first week, I was genuinely happy to help. I cooked her favorite meals, gave her the downstairs guest room, and even rearranged my schedule so I could drive her to physical therapy. But Evelyn wasn't the type to settle quietly into a corner. She was the kind of woman who liked to command the room without saying a word, the kind who would sit at the kitchen table perfectly silent while I cooked, and somehow make me feel like every chop of the knife was wrong. At first, I chalked it up to my own insecurity. She'd raised Michael. Maybe we just had different ways of doing things. But then came the helpful suggestions. Oh dear, Michael likes his coffee a bit stronger. Clara, you might want to use less salt in the stew. It's not good for men. He's always preferred the blue towels. I don't know why you bought beige. Michael never corrected her. In fact, sometimes he'd nod along as if she was offering valuable advice. Then came the little accidents. My favorite mug mysteriously chipped. The sweater Michael bought me for our anniversary shrunk in the wash, though I'd never known her to make a laundry mistake before. My mail got misplaced, my spice rack rearranged. I told myself it was petty to notice these things, but noticing and ignoring are not the same thing. I remember the first real crack in our marriage. It was a Saturday morning in late autumn. I'd planned a quiet breakfast for just the two of us, pancakes, fresh berries, coffee. Michael had promised me the night before that it would be our morning, but when I came downstairs, Evelyn was already in the kitchen flipping through a magazine at the table. "Oh, I told Michael I'd make eggs today," she said, not looking up. "You can put that pancake batter away for tomorrow." I glanced at Michael, expecting him to say something to remind her we'd planned this, but he just shrugged. She already started Clara. No point wasting the eggs. It was such a small moment, but it left me with a lump in my throat. I ate her overcooked eggs that morning, each bite tasting like defeat. After that, Evelyn seemed to grow bolder. She inserted herself into our conversations, our decisions, even our finances. She'd comment on how much I spent on groceries, question why I needed new shoes, hint that maybe I wasn't contributing enough to the household. And Michael? He started to echo her. Not word for word, but close enough that I could tell her voice was in his head. He began using phrases I'd never heard from him before. Maybe you should budget better, or do you really need that? It was like watching him slip away inch by inch, but every time I tried to talk to him about it, he'd say I was overreacting or being too sensitive. The real turning point came just before winter. We were sitting in the living room, the three of us, when Evelyn brought up the idea of reorganizing the house. "It'll be good for everyone," she said sweetly. "We can make the guest room into a storage space, and Clara can use the smaller upstairs room for her things." I laughed, thinking it was a joke. But Michael didn't laugh. "It makes sense," he said, looking right at me. "We don't use that room much." I realized then that they'd been talking about this behind my back. My own husband was making plans for my belongings without even asking me. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling while Michael slept beside me, and I felt something in me start to harden. I began keeping mental notes. Every time Evelyn undermined me, every time Michael chose her comfort over mine, every moment where I was made to feel like an outsider in my own marriage. By the time winter arrived, I wasn't surprised when small arguments turned into open hostility. Evelyn no longer pretended her comments were helpful. They were sharp, meant to draw blood. And Michael? He'd stopped pretending he was neutral. One night, I overheard them talking in the kitchen. Evelyn's voice was low but firm. "She's not right for you, Michael. You know it. She doesn't take care of you the way she should." And Michael, he didn't defend me. He didn't even hesitate before saying, "Maybe you're right." I stood there in the dark hallway, my hands trembling, my heart hammering. That was the moment I realized I was losing this battle. Not because I hadn't tried, but because I was the only one still fighting for us. The snow had just started falling that week, and I remember thinking it matched the way I felt inside, cold, quiet, and suffocating. What I didn't know yet was that this slow frost creeping into my marriage was about to turn into a blizzard. And when it did, I'd be standing outside wondering how I ever let myself get snowed in like this. If I had to pinpoint the moment when the frost between Michael and me became something sharp enough to cut, it would be the day I realized he wasn't just tolerating his mother's interference, he was actively siding with her. It was late November, the kind of day when the air feels brittle and the light dies early. I had been out running errands trying to get groceries for the week before the first real snowstorm hit. When I came back, the house felt different. Not physically, but in the way you can walk into a room and instantly sense that something has shifted in your absence. I followed the sound of voices into the living room. Michael and Evelyn were sitting close together on the couch, the coffee table between them covered with papers. My papers. Bank statements, receipts, even an old pay stub from my freelance proofreading work. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. "What's going on?" I asked, setting the grocery bags down harder than I meant to. Evelyn didn't even flinch. "We're just taking a look at the finances," she said smoothly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to rifle through my personal documents without permission. "Michael deserves to know how money is being handled." I turned to Michael, waiting for him to step in to say she'd gone too far. Instead, he crossed his arms and said, "She's right, Clara. We need to be on the same page." The implication was clear: we didn't include me unless it was about accountability. I was no longer a partner. I was a suspect. That night, I lay awake listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs. Michael was snoring softly beside me, but my mind was a storm. I kept replaying the scene in my head, the casual way Evelyn had assumed authority, the ease with which Michael had allowed it. There was a time when he would have been furious if anyone, even family, had violated my privacy like that. Now, it was as if my boundaries didn't exist at all. The days that followed were full of little reinforcements of my new position. Evelyn began addressing questions about the house bill's repairs, purchases directly to Michael, as if I were a tenant rather than a co-owner. If I answered, she would give a thin smile and say, "I think Michael should decide." One Saturday afternoon, we were in the kitchen preparing for a small gathering with Michael's old college friends. I was chopping vegetables, Evelyn was at the stove, and Michael was pouring drinks. I mentioned to him that we might need to set out an extra chair for dinner. Evelyn's voice cut in before he could respond. "Oh no, dear. You don't need to worry about the seating. I've already taken care of it." I stared at her. The knife paused mid-chop. It wasn't about the chair. It was about the way she said it, like I was a child interfering in grown-up matters. Michael just smiled faintly, as though she'd said something clever. That evening during dinner, I noticed how Michael seemed to lean toward her whenever she spoke, nodding along with her stories, laughing at her jokes. When I spoke, he'd glance at me briefly before returning his attention to her. His friends noticed too. One of them even joked, "Michael, you've got two women in your life, but only one gets your ear." It got a laugh from everyone but me. The humiliation of it lingered long after the guests left. I confronted him in the kitchen while we were cleaning up. "Do you realize how it looks? How it feels?" I asked. He frowned as if I were being unreasonable. "It feels like you're always looking for something to fight about. Can't you just get along with her?" That was the problem. Getting along in his mind meant letting Evelyn dictate everything without resistance. As winter settled in, the house felt smaller, the walls closing in around me. Evelyn began occupying more of the shared spaces, the living room, the dining room, leaving me to retreat to our bedroom just to have a moment to myself. If I tried to read in the living room, she'd turn on the TV at full volume. If I cooked, she'd fix the meal by adding her own seasonings. It was a constant, unspoken reminder: this is my territory now. But the worst part wasn't her behavior. It was Michael's gradual transformation. He started picking up her phrasing, her mannerisms. If I forgot to take out the trash, he'd sigh and say, "You really need to be more attentive, Clara," in the same tone Evelyn used when she spoke about people she pitied. If I mentioned feeling left out, he'd tilt his head almost mockingly and say, "You always make everything about you." I began noticing something else. Evelyn didn't just undermine me. She seemed to be deliberately pushing Michael to see me as a liability. She'd point out if I spent too much time working on a project instead of cooking dinner. She'd comment on how tired I looked, then glance at Michael as if to say, "See, she can't keep up." It all came to a head one bitterly cold evening in early December. Michael and I had been planning to attend a holiday event downtown. I'd bought a new dress for it, something simple but elegant, hoping to remind both of us of the couple we used to be. But when I came downstairs ready to leave, Evelyn was in the hallway blocking my way. "Michael's not going tonight," she said flatly. "He's feeling under the weather and he shouldn't be dragged out into the cold." I turned to Michael, confused. "You didn't tell me you were sick?" He avoided my eyes. "I just started feeling it. Maybe you should go without me." I stood there for a moment, realizing the truth: he wasn't sick. He just didn't want to spend an evening away from her. I went alone, but I didn't stay long. The lights, the music, the laughter, it all felt like another world I no longer belonged to. I came home early to find the two of them in the living room, watching a movie, sharing a bowl of popcorn like I'd never existed. That night, lying in bed, I finally admitted something to myself. This wasn't my marriage anymore. It was a partnership between Michael and his mother, and I was an unwelcome third party. From that point on, my instincts shifted. I stopped trying to win him back. Instead, I began quietly bracing for whatever came next. I didn't know the exact form it would take: an argument, a confrontation, maybe even him asking me to leave, but I knew it was coming. And when it did, I needed to be ready. What I didn't realize then was that the breaking point wouldn't be something private whispered in the shadows. It would happen in the open, in a moment so humiliating it would burn into my memory forever. And it would take place at our own dinner table. It was one of those nights that still tastes bitter in my memory. The air outside had been frigid all day, and the frost on the windows caught the light from the street lamps, throwing strange shapes across the dining room walls. I had spent the better part of the afternoon preparing dinner: a slow-roasted chicken with garlic, and herbs, mashed potatoes, and green beans tossed in olive oil. Cooking had always been my way of reclaiming a small piece of control in a house that no longer felt like mine. Michael had invited his cousin Daniel and Daniel's wife Lucy over for dinner. On the surface, it was just a family get-together, but I knew the dynamic well enough to sense the trap. Evelyn always seemed to find ways to make these gatherings less about connection and more about performance. And the performance she preferred, the one where I was cast as the incompetent, undeserving wife. I could hear her in the kitchen while I was setting the table, her voice carrying easily. "Daniel hasn't been here since you redecorated the living room, Michael. You should give him a proper tour." Her tone was syrupy, but I knew the subtext a tour meant showing off all the things she had arranged since moving in. When they all returned to the table, Evelyn took the seat directly to Michael's right, as she always did when guests were over. I sat across from her beside Lucy, trying to maintain polite conversation. Daniel complimented the aroma of the chicken, and I allowed myself a small smile. Maybe this night would pass without incident. Then it began. Michael had barely finished carving the chicken when Evelyn leaned forward, fork in hand, and said, "You know, Clara, I was telling Michael earlier that it might be better if you used my recipe for roast chicken next time. Yours is fine, but it tends to dry out." I froze mid-motion, the serving spoon hovering over the potatoes. My first instinct was to laugh it off, but something in her eyes told me she wasn't just making small talk, she was setting the tone. Lucy, trying to diffuse the tension, said, "Oh, I'm sure it's delicious. It smells amazing." But Evelyn wasn't done. "Smelling good isn't everything, dear. Presentation matters too. See how the skin's a little unevenly browned? That's because she didn't baste it enough." She looked at me directly as she said it, her voice soft, almost pitying, as if she were teaching a child. I felt the heat rising to my face, but before I could respond, Michael chuckled and said, "She's right, Clara. Mom's got years of experience with this stuff." The words stung more than the criticism itself. It wasn't about chicken. It was about Michael siding with her publicly without a moment's hesitation. I swallowed hard, forcing a polite smile, and focused on serving Lucy some potatoes. But Evelyn, sensing she'd drawn blood, pressed on. "And maybe next time we could set the table earlier. Guests shouldn't walk in and see you still rushing around in your apron." She gestured toward Daniel and Lucy with her fork, as if they were witnesses in her case against me. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, murmuring something about how everything looked lovely, but Michael didn't step in. If anything, he seemed almost entertained, his lips curved in that faint smirk I'd begun to hate. It was then that I realized Evelyn wasn't just undermining me in private anymore. She'd moved the battleground into the open, confident that Michael would back her up. The conversation moved on, or at least the others tried to move it on, but I barely tasted my food. I kept my head down, my hands steady, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing me flinch again. But inside, my thoughts were anything but calm. By the time dessert came around, the humiliation had solidified into something heavier, a kind of numb awareness that this was the reality now. Evelyn could humiliate me in front of anyone she pleased, and Michael would either laugh or look the other way. After Daniel and Lucy left, I began clearing the table in silence. Michael lounged in the living room, scrolling through his phone, while Evelyn trailed behind me in the kitchen. "You took that well," she said in a low voice, as if complimenting me. "Maybe you're learning." I turned to her slowly, my hand still gripping a stack of plates. "Learning what that? Sometimes it's better to let someone who knows more take the lead," she replied, her smile thin but sharp. I wanted to hurl the plates at the floor, to shatter something, anything, just to break the false calm that seemed to hang over everything. Instead, I set them carefully on the counter, my hands trembling. Michael walked in, then looking between us. "Everything okay?" he asked casually. I could have told him the truth. I could have said, "No, everything is not okay. Your mother is chipping away at me piece by piece, and you're letting her." But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I simply said, "Fine." Later that night, lying in bed with my back to him, I thought about how silence can be its own kind of weapon. Evelyn wielded hers to suggest judgment without words. Michael used his to avoid accountability. And now I was using mine to protect what little of myself I had left. But here's the thing about silence: it doesn't last forever. Eventually, it either breaks or explodes. And mine was going to explode. I just didn't know that the spark would come from something as deceptively small as where my clothes were kept in the house. It started with a drawer. One cold morning, I went to grab a sweater from the dresser in our bedroom and found the top drawer half empty, The rest of my clothes neatly folded but not where I had left them. I opened the bottom drawer. More gaps. I checked the closet, my side of it, noticeably thinner hangers swinging slightly as if someone had just been there. My first thought was that Michael had decided to help with laundry, which would have been out of character but not impossible. My second thought, the one that made my stomach tighten, was that this had Evelyn's fingerprints all over it. When I came downstairs, I found her in the hallway with a laundry basket, my folded sweaters stacked on top. "Oh, good, you're up," she said, as if we'd planned this. "I've moved some of your things into the guest room closet. It'll give Michael more space for his suits." I stared at her. I didn't ask for my clothes to be moved. She gave me that patronizing smile I'd come to know so well. "I know, dear. But it just makes more sense. The guest room is closer to the laundry, and you don't need to clutter up your bedroom with so many things." "My bedroom?" I repeated slowly, the words tasting strange in my mouth. "That's our room. And my clothes belong there." Michael appeared from the kitchen, then coffee mug in hand, as if on cue. "Mom's just trying to help Clara. You do have a lot of stuff. This way it's more organized." I looked at him, searching for a flicker of understanding, but his face was calm, too calm, like he'd already decided there was nothing wrong with this. The way he spoke, it was clear this wasn't Evelyn's decision alone. They had talked about it, decided it together. It might sound small, ridiculous, even to be so rattled over clothes being moved. But it wasn't just about the sweaters or the space. It was about the message that my claim to this home, to my own marriage, was negotiable. That they could literally move me aside when it suited them. The changes didn't stop there. Over the next week, more of my belongings began migrating without my consent. My favorite reading chair vanished from the corner of the bedroom, reappearing in the guest room. The small jewelry box Michael had given me for our 3rd anniversary was relocated to a shelf in there, as though it no longer belonged in our shared space. Each time I confronted Michael, he brushed it off. "It's just temporary. You're overreacting. It's only furniture." But I knew better. These weren't random acts of tidying, they were deliberate steps in making me feel like a guest in my own home. The guest room, once a warm space for friends and relatives, took on a different atmosphere. The bedspread was stiff and cold, the lamp too dim, the walls bare. Every time I stepped inside, I felt the weight of displacement pressing on me. One evening, I came home from a long shift at the library to find Evelyn in the bedroom, my bedroom holding one of my perfume bottles. She looked up and said, "I'm just making room on the dresser for Michael's things. You can put your personal items in the other room." Something in me cracked. "That's not the other room," I said sharply. "That's the guest room. And I'm not a guest here." Her expression didn't change. If anything, she seemed amused by my outburst. "Well, that's up to Michael, isn't it?" she said lightly, as if it were a joke. Michael entered at that moment, sensing tension. "What's going on now?" I turned to him, my voice low but shaking. "She's moving me out of my own room." He sighed, that long, weary sigh he'd been perfecting over the past months. "No one's moving you out, Clara. We're just making the house more functional." "Why do you have to see a problem in everything?" "Because I thought it is a problem. It's a strategy." Every sweater, every chair, every piece of me moved from the bedroom was another brick in the wall they were building between us. That night, I lay awake in our bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling like an intruder. I could sense Evelyn's satisfaction in the next room, the way her shadow seemed to stretch into every corner of this house. Michael slept soundly beside me, utterly unbothered, as though nothing about this arrangement was strange. The final straw in this quiet erasure came on a Saturday morning. I went to grab my coat from the hall closet and found it missing. When I asked Evelyn, she said, "Oh, I put it in the guest room closet with your other things. It didn't belong here anymore." Didn't belong. The words landed like a punch. I realized then that this wasn't just about control, it was about ownership. Evelyn was marking her territory and Michael was letting her. And the territory she was claiming was my marriage. I wanted to confront them both to demand that my belongings be returned to remind Michael that I was his wife, not some temporary tenant. But I also knew how that scene would play out. Evelyn would tilt her head, Michael would sigh, and I'd be the one painted as irrational. So I said nothing outwardly, but inside, my silence was coiling tighter, winding itself into something dangerous. Every moved sweater, every relocated chair was another turn of the key. And one day, that key was going to unlock all the anger I'd been holding back. I didn't know it yet, but that day was coming sooner than I thought. And when it arrived, it wouldn't be about sweaters or chairs or even the guest room. It would be about them standing in the living room looking me in the eye and telling me I was a burden they no longer wanted to bear. If moving my belongings to the guest room had been a way of quietly pushing me out of my own space, the next phase was designed to strip me of something even more essential: my independence. It started innocently enough, or at least it was dressed up to look that way. One morning, Michael came into the kitchen while I was making coffee holding a printout of our bank statements. His voice was calm, almost casual. "I've been thinking," he said, sliding the papers onto the counter, "we should probably start keeping a closer eye on our spending. You know, with the economy and everything." I glanced at the numbers. Yes, we'd had some higher bills lately, mostly groceries since Evelyn insisted on specific expensive ingredients, but nothing alarming. "I always keep track of what I spend," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "That's not the point," he replied, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "It just makes sense for me to handle the main account. We can set you up with a separate one for your personal expenses." I blinked at him. "You mean I wouldn't have access to our joint account anymore?" He shrugged as if it were nothing. "You'd still have money. I'd transfer some each month. But this way things are streamlined." It was Evelyn who floated in, then wearing that faint smile she reserved for moments when she thought she'd already won. "I told Michael it would take some pressure off you," she said sweetly. "You wouldn't have to worry about all those numbers. Pressure off me." As if being cut off from the account I'd contributed to for years was some kind of gift. I wanted to argue to point out that I wasn't a child needing an allowance, but I also knew the trap. If I protested too strongly, I'd be accused of being defensive, of having something to hide. And if I didn't protest, I'd be complicit in my own disempowerment. So I chose my words carefully. "I don't think this is necessary," I said, folding my arms. "I've managed our expenses just fine." Michael gave a little laugh, but there was no warmth in it. "You're making this into a bigger deal than it is. It's just easier this way." Easier for him, I thought. Easier for her. By the end of that week, the adjustment was in place. My debit card for the joint account was deactivated, replaced with a new one tied to the smaller account Michael had set up for me. Each month, he transferred a set amount, barely enough for my personal needs. If I needed more, I was expected to ask. That's when the real game began. Suddenly, every purchase was up for debate. If I bought a new coat, Evelyn would raise an eyebrow. Was that really necessary? If I picked up a bottle of wine for dinner, Michael would comment, "You know, we're trying to cut back." Even mundane items like shampoo or a paperback from the library's sale table became suspect. The worst was grocery shopping. Evelyn insisted on coming with me to help, which really meant monitoring every item in the cart. She'd swap out my choices for her preferred brands, which were inevitably more expensive. Then later, she'd point to the total and tisk, "You see, this is why Michael needs to manage the finances." The control seeped into other areas too. I noticed that Michael began asking about my freelance work more often, not out of interest, but to check how much I was earning. He suggested no, insisted that all payments from my clients go into the account he managed. "It's just simpler," he said, again that word, becoming a blade. What struck me most was how quickly I began to second-guess myself. I found myself hesitating before buying anything, even small necessities, because I didn't want to justify it later. I started keeping receipts in a neat little pile ready for the inevitable inquisition. And still, Evelyn wasn't satisfied. One afternoon, I overheard her talking to Michael in the kitchen while I was upstairs. Her voice was low, but the smugness carried. "You're doing the right thing, Michael. If she can't manage money properly, it's better for both of you. Manage money properly." The phrase made my stomach twist. I'd been paying bills, balancing budgets, and making do for years long before Evelyn moved in. This wasn't about competence, it was about control. The breaking point in this particular battle came over something as small as a pair of gloves. It was January, the cold, sharp enough to sting your skin. My old gloves had a tear along the seam, so while running errands, I bought a simple black pair from a department store, nothing fancy, just warm. That evening, as I came in from the cold, Evelyn spotted them on the table. "Oh," she said, her voice dripping with false surprise. "New gloves. Did you ask Michael about that?" I turned slowly to look at her. I didn't know I needed permission to keep my hands from freezing. Michael walked in just then, catching the tail end of my sentence. "What's going on?" he asked, already frowning at me. "She bought new gloves," Evelyn said, shaking her head slightly. Michael's gaze flicked to me. "Couldn't you have waited until next month? We just talked about keeping expenses down. It was a $15 pair of gloves. $15. I wanted to scream, to throw them in his face, and ask if he thought warmth was a luxury. Instead, I said nothing. I simply picked up the gloves and walked out of the room, my silence heavier than any words. That night, I realized something important. They weren't just trying to limit my spending, they were trying to make me dependent. If they could control the money, they could control me. And if they could control me, they could eventually remove me altogether without a fight. But here's what they didn't know: I'd started keeping my own account months ago. Just a small one tucked away with money from odd freelance projects I hadn't told Michael about. It wasn't much, but it was mine. And as their grip tightened, so did my resolve to use it, not just to survive, but to escape. I could feel the storm building, the inevitable clash that would force everything into the open. And deep down, I knew they were underestimating me. The moment of confrontation wasn't far off. But before it came, there would be one more scene, one that would strip away any illusion that this was still a marriage of equals. It would happen in the living room in broad daylight, with both of them standing over me like I was the problem they'd finally decided to solve. The living room had always been my favorite part of the house when Michael and I first bought it. Big windows that flooded the space with light in the mornings. The soft couch we'd saved up for a bookshelf we'd filled together with novels, travel guides, and family photo albums. But by the time January was halfway through, it didn't feel like my space anymore. Evelyn spent most of her days there, knitting or watching her programs at a volume that could be heard from upstairs. She'd claim the armchair near the window as if it had always been hers, a little basket of yarn at her feet, her presence a constant reminder that this wasn't my home to control. That afternoon, I was sitting on the couch with a cup of tea, going over some proofreading work on my laptop. Outside, the sky was that deep, brittle blue that comes just before sunset in winter, and the light streaming in through the glass was sharp enough to make me squint. Evelyn came in from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She didn't sit down right away. Instead, she stood by the coffee table looking at me, the way one might look at an unswept floor. "Clara," she said, "we need to talk." The way she said we made my stomach clench, because I knew we meant her, and Michael, not her, and me. "What is it?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. She sat in the armchair and folded the towel neatly in her lap as though preparing for a formal announcement. "This arrangement isn't working. You're, well, you're not pulling your weight around here." I blinked at her. "Excuse me." Michael appeared in the doorway, then leaning against the frame with his arms crossed. His presence confirmed what I already suspected: this was a coordinated attack. Evelyn pressed on. "You don't contribute enough financially, and when you do, it's not consistent. You spend too much time on little hobbies instead of real work. And around the house." She glanced toward the kitchen as if searching for evidence. "Let's just say I end up doing more than my share." I let out a short, incredulous laugh. More than your share, Evelyn. I do the cooking, the laundry, most of the cleaning. And yet, I'm the one who notices when the pantry is disorganized or the towels aren't folded properly, she interrupted smoothly. A home needs proper care, Clara. You can't just coast. My fingers tightened around my tea mug. Coast, I've been keeping this house running for years, Evelyn. Long before you moved in. Michael shifted slightly, his jaw tightening. Clara, this isn't about keeping score. Mom's just pointing out that things could be better organized. Oh, is that all? I said, my voice sharpening. Because it sounds to me like she's saying I'm a burden. Evelyn's smile didn't waver. Well, if that's how you want to interpret it. I looked at Michael, hoping foolishly that he'd step in, that he'd tell her she was crossing a line. Instead, he sighed in that weary, dismissive way I'd come to dread. Clara, maybe you should just listen for once instead of getting defensive. Mom's not trying to attack you. My stomach churned. You're siding with her. Again. I'm siding with reason. He replied, his voice calm in a way that made me want to scream. We can't keep pretending everything's fine when it's not. And honestly, maybe some time apart would do us both good. There it was, the thinly veiled suggestion that I should leave. I set my mug down on the coffee table with deliberate care, afraid that if I held it a moment longer, my shaking hands would give me away. So that's what this is about. You want me out. Evelyn's eyes glittered with something between satisfaction and pity. If you took a little break, it might give you a new perspective. And it would certainly make things easier here. I felt the air leave my lungs. Easier for who? For you. So you can run the house without me in the way. Or for you, Michael. So you don't have to choose between your wife and your mother. Michael didn't answer right away, and that silence was louder than anything he could have said. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost gentle, as if he were doing me a kindness. Clara, maybe you should think about it. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier. I looked between them, my husband who had once promised to stand by me and his mother, who had made it her mission to erase me from my own life. I wanted to fight back, to hurl every truth I'd been swallowing for months, but I also knew that nothing I said in that moment would change the outcome. They'd already decided. This wasn't a discussion. It was a verdict. So I stood up, my legs unsteady but my back straight. I see, I said quietly. You've made your choice. Michael opened his mouth to speak, but I didn't let him. Don't worry, I'll make mine too. I walked past him without another glance up the stairs to the bedroom that was no longer mine. I closed the door and leaned against it, my breath coming fast. My hands trembled, but not from fear. It was something sharper now, the edge of anger, of resolve. I knew deep in my bones that this was only the prelude. The real breaking point hadn't happened yet. When it did, it wouldn't be a conversation in the living room. It would be something colder, crueler, something designed to push me out completely. And when that day came, I would be ready. The next morning, I woke up with that heavy, dull ache in my chest that comes from crying yourself to sleep. I hadn't even realized I'd been crying until I tasted the salt on my lips. Michael had gone to work early, or at least that's what he'd said, and Evelyn's footsteps creaked downstairs, the faint sound of her humming already setting my teeth on edge. I lay in bed for a few more minutes, staring at the ceiling. I knew I couldn't just let the conversation from the night before sit there festering. They'd made it clear I wasn't wanted. The question now was whether I had anywhere else to go. I grabbed my phone and scrolled to my sister Hannah's number. She lived 3 states away with a husband and 2 young kids. We hadn't been especially close in recent years, but she was still family. If anyone would understand, maybe it would be her. She answered on the 3rd ring. Clara? Wow. It's been a while. Everything okay? I hesitated. Not really. I think Michael wants me to leave for a while. Things with Evelyn have gotten bad. Really bad. There was a pause. "Oh, Clara, I'm sorry to hear that. But you know things have been tight here and the kids take up all the space. I don't think we could manage another person staying long term." Her tone wasn't unkind, but it was final. She didn't even offer a couch for a few nights. I thanked her anyway and hung up, staring at my phone as if it might produce another option if I just looked hard enough. Next, I tried my oldest friend, Marlene. We'd been inseparable in college, but life had drifted us apart. She'd moved to another city, built her career, married a man who made good money. I thought maybe she'd at least let me crash on her sofa until I figured something out. When she picked up, I launched into a shortened version of the truth. Her response was sympathetic, but distant. "Oh, Clara, that sounds awful. I wish I could help, but we're actually renovating right now and the house is a mess. There's nowhere for you to stay." I bit back the urge to remind her that in our 20s, I'd once let her stay with me for 6 weeks rent-free when she'd broken up with her boyfriend. What good would that do now? Call after call, the pattern repeated. Some people didn't pick up. Others offered vague, polite refusals: too busy, no space, wrong timing. The unspoken message was clear. Your problems aren't my problems. By noon, I was sitting at the kitchen table with my phone face down, my untouched coffee growing cold beside me. Evelyn breezed in from the living room carrying a folded stack of laundry. She looked me over, her gaze lingering on the slump of my shoulders. "Rough morning?" she asked, as if she didn't already know. I didn't answer. She set the laundry down and leaned on the counter, her voice dripping with feigned concern. "Sometimes, Clara, life has a way of showing us when it's time to move on. Maybe this is just that time for you." I met her eyes then, and for a moment I let her see the anger I'd been holding back. "You'd like that, wouldn't you?" Her lips curved into a small, satisfied smile. "It's not about what I want. It's about what's best for everyone." That afternoon, I considered calling Michael's cousin Lucy. She'd always been kind to me, had even rolled her eyes at some of Evelyn's comments during that humiliating dinner. But before I could pick up the phone, I remembered something. Lucy was Michael's blood, not mine. And blood has a way of sticking together even when you wish it wouldn't. I spent the rest of the day pacing the house, avoiding Evelyn, my mind spinning. The truth was settling in like an icy draft. I had nowhere to go. No sibling ready to take me in. No friend eager to help. By evening, Michael came home, shrugging off his coat and setting his briefcase down by the door. "Everything okay here today?" he asked casually, as if the previous night's conversation had been about something as minor as changing the curtains. I stared at him. "I called my sister. My friends. No one can take me in. So if that was your plan to get me out, it's not going to be that easy." He didn't flinch. "Clara, you're making this harder than it needs to be. We're just talking about a little space." "A little space." My voice rose despite myself. "You've been moving me out of my own bedroom, cutting off my access to our money, letting your mother treat me like a trespasser. And now you want me gone. That's not space, Michael. That's eviction without the paperwork." Evelyn appeared in the doorway, then drying her hands with a kitchen towel. Maybe this conversation would be better when everyone's calmer. Her tone was perfectly measured, but her eyes gave her away. There was no intention of having this conversation again later. She wanted it settled. She wanted me out. I realized, standing there with both of them watching me, that my isolation was complete. They'd cornered me in every way that mattered: physically, financially, emotionally. I was still in the house, but the ground beneath me had already shifted. That night, I lay awake listening to the winter wind scraping against the windows. Somewhere in the distance, a branch tapped rhythmically against the siding. It felt like the house itself was counting down the hours until I'd be gone. And deep down, I knew the countdown had already begun. The day they forced me out wasn't some vague threat anymore. It was coming in soon. The morning it all came to a head began deceptively calm. The sky outside was a pale, washed-out gray, the kind that promises snow without delivering it yet. I was in the kitchen making tea, hoping to avoid both Michael and Evelyn for as long as possible. My nerves had been stretched thin for weeks, and every conversation felt like walking across black ice one wrong step, and I'd be flat on my back. I heard Michael's footsteps before I saw him. He came into the kitchen, rubbing his hands together for warmth. He didn't sit down. Instead, he leaned against the counter, studying me. "We need to talk," he said. I kept my eyes on the kettle. About what? He took a deep breath like he was about to deliver bad news in the gentlest way possible. "I think it's time you stayed somewhere else for a while." There it was. Stripped of the euphemisms, the suggestion became a command. My hands tightened on the handle of the kettle. "I already told you, Michael. I have nowhere else to go." "You'll figure something out," he said, as if he were talking about finding a new brand of cereal. "It's not permanent." "But you and Mom, this tension isn't healthy for anyone." I turned to face him. "No, Michael. This isn't about tension. This is about you letting her push me out of my own home because it's easier than standing up to her." Evelyn's voice floated in from the doorway. "That's not fair, Clara. This isn't just my decision. Michael sees it too." I looked at her standing there with her arms folded, her mouth set in that calm, self-satisfied line. "You've been undermining me since the day you moved in, and now you're getting exactly what you wanted." Her expression didn't change. "What I want is a peaceful home. You can't seem to provide that." The tea kettle whistled shrill and sharp in the tense air. I turned off the burner, but the sound was still ringing in my head. Michael stepped closer. "Clara, I think you should start packing a bag today, just for a little while." I stared at him, stunned by the cold finality in his voice. "You're asking your wife to leave her home, in the middle of winter, with nowhere to go." His jaw tightened. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." "Harder for who?" "For you, for her." My voice cracked, the words coming faster now. "You think you can just push me out like I'm some unwanted guest? I built a life in this house. I built a life with you." Evelyn stepped forward, then her tone shifting into mock reasonableness. "We're not saying you can't come back. Just take some time. Cool off. Cool off." I almost laughed bitterly because the irony of those words was suffocating. I was already freezing inside from months of being shut out, ignored, and controlled. I set my cup down a little too hard, the ceramic clinking against the counter. "You know what, fine. If you want me gone so badly, why don't you just admit it outright instead of hiding behind this cooling off nonsense?" Michael's gaze flicked to his mother, then back to me. "If that's what you want to hear? Fine. Yes. I think it would be better if you left for now." The room went quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "Then say it properly, Michael. Say you're kicking me out." He didn't speak. His silence was answer enough. Something in me hardened right then. The ache in my chest didn't vanish, but it stopped being soft. It became sharp like glass. I realized that whatever love I'd been holding onto had been gone from his side for a long time. Evelyn, of course, couldn't resist the final word. "We'll help you pack," she said, her voice almost cheerful. I walked past both of them without responding, my feet carrying me upstairs on autopilot. In the bedroom, my bedroom, though it no longer felt like it, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the dresser. I thought about all the little ways they'd chipped away at me, the moved clothes, the bank account, the public humiliations, the constant undermining. And now this was the end they'd been working toward all along. I didn't pack that day. Not yet. Part of me wanted to force them to make the next move to see how far they were willing to go. But deep down, I knew that day was coming, and soon. As night fell, the cold seemed to seep in through the walls. I could hear Evelyn's voice downstairs, low and conspiratorial, the occasional murmur of Michael's reply. They were making plans. My fate was being decided in my own home without me. I lay awake long after the lights downstairs went out, listening to the creak of the floorboards, the groan of the old house in the wind. It felt like the walls were closing in, like the house itself wanted me gone. And maybe it did. Because the next time they brought up cooling off, they wouldn't be asking. They'd be telling. And it wouldn't be just words, it would be action. And that action would come on the coldest day of the year. The morning it happened, the world outside was white and silent, the kind of silence that isn't peace, but warning. Snow had been falling since before dawn, blanketing everything in a thick, unbroken sheet. The air had that sharp, metallic cold that stings your lungs when you breathe too deeply. I woke to the sound of voices downstairs, low, urgent, too muffled to make out the words, but clear enough in intent. My gut told me before my mind caught up this was it. I dressed slowly, pulling on a worn sweater and the old jeans I usually reserved for errands. I don't know why I moved so deliberately, maybe because I wanted to stretch the moments before whatever was coming. My hands trembled anyway. When I stepped into the hallway, the voices sharpened into words. Michael's tone was clipped, Evelyn's firm but tinged with satisfaction. They stopped speaking when they heard me on the stairs. Both of them were in the living room. Michael stood near the couch, hands in his pockets, avoiding my eyes. Evelyn sat in her armchair posture, perfectly straight, like a queen about to pronounce judgment. Michael began, his voice too calm. "We've talked about this. It's time for you to go." I stopped at the bottom of the stairs. "Right now," Evelyn answered before he could. "Yes. The sooner you get settled somewhere else, the better for everyone." I glanced at the window, snow still pouring down the street, nearly buried. "You're throwing me out in the middle of a blizzard." Michael shifted his weight, his gaze fixed on the floor. "We can't keep living like this. It's toxic. Toxic." I stepped closer, my voice rising. "You've let your mother dismantle my life piece by piece, and now you're acting like you're doing me a favor by finishing the job." Evelyn stood then, coming to stand beside him. "You've had chance after chance to make this work, Clara. You refuse to adapt. This house needs harmony, and you don't bring it." Harmony. The word made my stomach turn. I looked between them, searching Michael's face for any flicker of doubt, any sign that he might still see me as the woman he once loved. There was nothing. Just resignation. "You have 10 minutes." Evelyn said, her voice steady, her eyes fixed on me. 10 minutes. Like I was a tenant behind on rent. I turned without another word and went upstairs. My breath came fast, but my hands moved with a strange calm. I grabbed the bag I'd packed halfway in my mind for weeks, a few clothes, my wallet, my phone charger, the framed photo of my parents from the night they met. I hesitated over the small jewelry box in the drawer, then slipped it into the bag. When I came back down, the house felt different. The air was heavier, the light colder. Michael stood by the door, coat on, as if he were ready to walk me out. Evelyn was in the kitchen, humming. He opened the door, and a blast of wind slapped me in the face. Snowflakes stung my cheeks. The world outside was a blur of white and gray. "Where will you go?" he asked quietly. I pulled my scarf tighter around my neck. "I don't know. But wherever it is, it'll be somewhere I'm not treated like a problem to solve." For a moment, I thought he might say something, an apology, a second thought. But he just nodded, his expression unreadable, and stepped back. I stepped onto the porch, the snow crunching under my boots. The cold bit through my coat, instantly seeping into my bones. Behind me, the door closed with a heavy, final sound. I stood there for a second, staring at the street, half hidden under snowdrifts, before I forced myself to move. My bag felt heavier with every step. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to keep walking. Each breath burned my lungs, but I welcomed the sting. It was proof that I was still alive, still moving, still mine. Halfway down the street, I glanced back once. The house stood there, warm light glowing faintly through the windows, a fortress I'd been exiled from. For a moment, the ache was almost enough to send me back. But then I remembered the voices, the accusations, the months of slow erasure, and I kept walking. By the time I reached the bus shelter at the corner, my fingers were numb. I sat down on the cold bench, snow gathering in my hair, and took out my phone. I didn't have a plan. All I had was the number of a friend I hadn't spoken to in years, someone who might still remember the version of me that existed before Michael and Evelyn made me small. I hit call, and as the phone rang, I realized something. I might be out in the cold now, but I was also free. Not safe yet, not steady, but free. And for the first time in months, that was enough to keep me breathing. The snow was relentless. By the time I'd been sitting in that bus shelter for 10 minutes, it had piled up in little ridges along the edges of the bench and dusted the tops of my boots. My breath came in short, sharp bursts, each one visible in the frigid air. The phone call had gone to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. I didn't know what I would have said anyway. "Hi, it's Clara. I know we haven't spoken in years, but I've just been kicked out into a snowstorm. Mind if I show up at your door?" Even to my own ears, it sounded like a plea from someone who'd already lost too much. The street was quiet, the sound of the wind swallowing everything else. Every so often, a car crept by its tires, making that distinctive crunch over the snow, the driver hidden behind a fogged windshield. None of them stopped. I told myself I should get up, keep moving, anything to fight the creeping numbness in my toes. But I stayed seated for another few minutes, as if the shelter's thin plexiglass walls could protect me from more than just the wind. When I finally stood, my legs felt stiff, reluctant. I started walking toward the main road, where I knew there'd be more traffic, maybe a cafe or a gas station where I could thaw out. The snow was ankle-deep in places, and each step felt like wading through resistance. Half a block later, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Natalie. Natalie and I had been friends over a decade ago, back when we both worked at the same small publishing house. She'd moved to the other side of town after getting married, and though we'd lost touch, I'd kept her number. A month ago, in a moment of desperation, I'd sent her a holiday greeting, a little thread of connection I didn't even know I'd need. "Hey, just got your missed call. Everything okay?" I typed back quickly, my fingers stiff from the cold. "Not really. Got kicked out. Nowhere to go. In the snow." The typing bubbles appeared, disappeared, then came back. "Where are you?" I sent her my location, half expecting her to say she couldn't help. Instead, her reply came almost instantly. "Stay put. I'll come get you." Relief hit me so fast I nearly stumbled. I ducked back into the bus shelter, clutching my bag like it might disappear if I let it go. 10 minutes later, a small gray sedan pulled up, its wipers working overtime. The passenger door swung open, and there was Natalie leaning over from the driver's seat, her hair tucked into a knitted hat. "Get in before you freeze solid," she said. The blast of warm air from the car's heater felt like a shock against my frozen skin. I slid into the seat, slamming the door against the wind, and for a moment I just sat there, breathing in the scent of peppermint gum and wool. Natalie pulled away from the curb, glancing at me sideways. "Do you want to talk about it now or later?" "Later," I said quietly. "If that's okay." She nodded. "My place isn't big, but you can stay as long as you need. The couch pulls out into a bed. We'll figure the rest out later." Those words, "as long as you need," nearly undid me. I pressed my lips together, swallowing hard. Her apartment was small but warm, with mismatched throw blankets and a tiny Christmas tree in the corner, still holding on to the last glimmers of the holiday season. She handed me a towel and a sweatshirt, pointing me toward the bathroom. "Hot shower," she said. "Then tea." I stood under the stream of hot water until my skin prickled from the change in temperature. It wasn't just the cold leaving my body, it was something deeper, the slow thaw of weeks, months of being shut out and diminished. When I came out, Natalie was waiting with 2 mugs of chamomile tea. We sat at her small kitchen table, steam curling between us. "I don't know where to start," I admitted. "Start anywhere," she said. So I did. I told her about Evelyn moving in, about the little criticisms that turned into deliberate erasure, about Michael's silence and eventual complicity. I told her about the moved belongings, the restricted bank account, the public humiliations. By the time I got to the snowstorm that morning, my voice was shaking. Natalie listened without interrupting, her hands wrapped around her mug. When I finally stopped, she let out a long breath. "Clara, you've been living in a war zone." I gave a humorless laugh. "A war zone with nice furniture." "You can't go back there," she said firmly. "I know," I said. And I meant it. For the first time, I could say those words without the echo of doubt in my chest. That night, I lay on the pull-out couch wrapped in one of Natalie's soft blankets, listening to the quiet hum of her radiator. Outside, the snow kept falling, but here, in this small borrowed space, I felt something I hadn't in months: safe. Not happy, not whole, but safe. And that was enough for now. What I didn't realize then was that this was the first step towards something bigger, a rebuilding, a reclamation. I didn't know how yet, but I was going to take back what they'd tried to strip from me. And when I did, Michael and Evelyn would learn that throwing me out into the cold had only made me stronger. The first morning I woke up in Natalie's apartment, I didn't recognize the ceiling above me. For a split second, I thought maybe it had all been a bad dream. The snow, the locked door, Michael's voice telling me it was time to go. Then I turned my head and saw the little artificial Christmas tree in the corner, and it all came back like a wave. I was out. I was gone. And I wasn't going back. Natalie was already up, bustling around the kitchen in fuzzy socks, humming to herself. The smell of coffee and toasted bread wrapped around me like a blanket. She greeted me with a smile that didn't ask for explanations. "Eat first," she said, sliding a plate toward me. "Plan later." The toast was simple, but it felt like a small act of restoration, food given without judgment or conditions. It struck me how long it had been since I'd been in a kitchen where every movement wasn't being monitored, every choice silently questioned. We didn't talk much while we ate, and I was grateful. My mind was already racing ahead, cataloging the realities. I had a few $100s in my hidden account. My phone, a change of clothes, and the jewelry box with a few pieces that might sell for decent money if things got desperate. I didn't have a car anymore. Michael had insisted years ago that we only needed one, and it had made sense for it to be in his name. After breakfast, Natalie sat down with her laptop. "We'll start small," she said. "Figure out what you have and what you need immediately. Then we can work towards something longer term." Her practical tone steadied me. We made a list. Warm clothes, the ones I'd left behind, weren't coming back to me. A prepaid phone plan separate from the one Michael paid for. A job that would give me steady income, not just freelance gigs. Somewhere, anywhere, I could eventually call my own. It was daunting seeing it written out like that, but it was also something I hadn't felt in a long time: actionable. That afternoon, I went through my phone and unfollowed Michael's social media accounts. I didn't want to see photos of the house of Evelyn in my armchair, of Michael smiling in the kitchen I used to cook in. It felt like cauterizing a wound, painful but necessary to stop the bleeding. But I didn't cut off all my lines of sight. Quietly, I kept following a few mutual acquaintances, the kind of people who liked to post without thinking about the ripples. Through them, I could still see little glimpses of what was happening back in that house. It wasn't long before those glimpses told me something interesting. Evelyn had been posting more on her own account, harmless photos of the snow, her knitting projects. But I noticed Michael wasn't in many of them. And when he was, he didn't look happy. There was a stiffness in his shoulders, a distracted look in his eyes. I didn't feel sorry for him, but I did file it away. The first concrete step I took was getting my own phone plan. Natalie drove me to a store where I paid cash for a prepaid SIM card. That little card felt like more than just access to calls and texts. It was a severed cord between me and the control Michael had kept over me. Next, I pulled together my resume and started applying for jobs. I wasn't picky. I just needed something to anchor me. A library assistant position opened up 2 neighborhoods over, and I applied that same night. At the same time, I reached out to an old contact from my freelance work, a small publisher who'd once been impressed with my editing speed. He didn't have anything big for me yet, but he promised to keep me in mind. It wasn't much, but it was a start. In the evenings, Natalie and I would sit at her kitchen table drinking tea and talking through scenarios. She never told me what I should do. She just asked questions until I found my own answers. It was maddening sometimes, but it forced me to think clearly. One night, about a week after I'd arrived, she asked, "Do you want revenge?" The question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on survival that I hadn't let myself frame it that way. But when I thought about Michael's face as he closed that door, Evelyn's smug little smile, the humiliation of the dinner table, the gloves, the bank account, the answer was obvious. "Yes," I said, "but not the kind that makes me look desperate, the kind that makes them wish they'd never touched me." Natalie smiled slowly. "Then you build yourself back up until they can't touch you, and when they come looking, because they will, you let them see exactly what they lost." Her words lit something in me. This wasn't just about scraping by anymore. This was about reclaiming the version of myself they'd tried to erase, and making it impossible for them to ignore it. Over the next few days, I kept building my small foundation. I sold one of the gold bracelets from my jewelry box for enough to cover a few weeks of expenses. I scheduled an interview at the library. I started keeping a notebook of everything I remembered from the last 2 years, the comments, the manipulations, even the dates of certain events. I didn't know yet how I'd use it, but I had a feeling it would come in handy. And slowly, I began to feel different. Not safe yet, not stable, but like someone who could be both eventually. Someone who could walk past Michael and Evelyn on the street one day and smile without a flicker of shame. The snow outside began to melt in thin, uneven patches. I knew winter wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time since that door slammed behind me, I felt like I had my own key, not to that house, but to something better. And deep down, I suspected that the story between me and them wasn't finished. Not yet. The library job came through faster than I expected. 2 weeks after submitting my application, I got a call from the branch manager inviting me for an interview. It was a modest position, part-time, assisting with cataloging and helping patrons, but it was steady, familiar work. The kind of quiet environment where I could think clearly and rebuild without feeling constantly watched. Natalie drove me to the interview. I wore the warmest, neatest outfit I could pull together from what I had, along with one of her scarves for extra polish. The branch itself was small but well kept, the air inside carrying that faint scent of old paper and dust that has always comforted me. The interview was straightforward. I talked about my past experience at the library before I married Michael, my organizational skills, my ability to focus for long hours. The manager, a woman named June, seemed genuinely pleased. "We could use someone like you," she said. "How soon can you start?" I walked out with a start date the following Monday. It wasn't a huge salary, but it was mine money that wouldn't pass through Michael's hands before reaching me. That weekend, I bought a secondhand satchel at a thrift store to carry my lunch and books to work. It was a small purchase, but symbolic. I was setting the stage for a life that was completely separate from theirs. The first few weeks were uneventful in the best possible way. I learned the systems, got to know the staff, and settled into the quiet rhythm of shelving books, assisting patrons, and occasionally covering the front desk. After months of walking on eggshells in my own home, the calm predictability was a relief. But there was still a restless part of me, the part that hadn't forgotten Natalie's question, "Do you want revenge?" That part was always taking mental notes, imagining what I would say or do if I crossed paths with Michael and Evelyn again. In early March, the first sign that I might get my chance arrived in the form of a text message. It was from Michael. "Clara, we need to talk." I stared at the screen, the familiar mix of anger and disbelief tightening in my chest. It had been nearly 2 months since the snowstorm. Not a word from him. And now suddenly we need to talk. I didn't reply right away. Instead, I took a screenshot and sent it to Natalie with the caption, "Guess who's remembered I exist?" She called me immediately. "You're not meeting him alone," she said. "I'm not meeting him at all," I replied. But later that night, lying awake on the pull-out couch, I kept thinking about the text. If he was reaching out, something must have shifted. And if something had shifted in that house, it could be an opportunity not to go back, but to understand exactly what was going on. The next day, curiosity won. I wrote back. What about his reply came fast. "Mom's health isn't good. She's been asking for you." I almost laughed out loud. Evelyn asking for me. The woman who had all but pushed me out the door herself. It reeked of desperation. I typed back, "That's unfortunate. I hope she has the support she needs." And I left it at that. Over the following week, Michael sent 2 more messages, both variations of, "We should meet," and "It's important." I didn't answer either. But each one confirmed something. The balance of power was shifting. They needed something from me now. I threw myself even harder into my work. By the end of March, I'd been offered extra hours, which meant a slightly bigger paycheck. It also meant I could start putting more into my hidden account. I opened a savings folder labeled Future and added a little to it every week. The library became my safe ground and Natalie's apartment my temporary home base. I didn't tell anyone at work about my personal life, not because I was ashamed, but because I wanted to protect the new identity I was building. Clara Whitmore here wasn't the discarded wife in a snowstorm. She was a capable, dependable part of the team. But I kept my eyes open for connections. One of the regular patrons was a retired lawyer named Frank, who loved history books. We'd chat sometimes while I checked out his materials, and I learned he had experience in property disputes and family law. I didn't tell him my story, but I listened carefully whenever he talked about how records and documentation could shift the outcome of a case. I started gathering my own records in earnest, not just the notes I'd already kept about Evelyn and Michael's behavior, but copies of anything that tied me financially or legally to the house. Old utility bills with my name on them, emails about repairs I'd arranged, even receipts for furniture I'd bought that was still sitting in that living room. Every scrap was a thread, and together they were weaving a net. I didn't know exactly when or how I'd cast it, but I wanted it ready. By April, I had a routine. Work at the library during the day, small freelance projects in the evenings and weekends spent slowly reclaiming my sense of self. Natalie was still my anchor, but I could feel the time approaching when I'd need to find my own place. And yet the text from Michael kept tugging at the back of my mind. Not because I missed him, I didn't, but because it meant there was a crack in their fortress. I didn't know if it was big enough to break them apart, but I intended to be ready if it widened. It wouldn't be long before I'd find out just how badly the cold I'd been thrown into was creeping back into their lives, and how much warmer mine had become without them. Michael's texts didn't stop. They multiplied. First it was, "We should talk." Then "It's important." Then, at 11:42 p.m. on a Tuesday, when the radiator in Natalie's apartment ticked like a quiet metronome. "Please, Clara, I'm asking you as your husband." That last word didn't land the way he meant it to. It didn't open a door inside me. It pointed to the one he'd slammed in my face. I didn't reply. I put the phone face down and stared at the ceiling until the shadows blurred. 2 mornings later, he called. I let it ring out. He called again. And again. On the fourth try, I answered not out of softness, but because curiosity can be its own form of courage. I put him on speaker, laid the phone next to my cup of tea, and let silence be the first move. "Clara," he said, breath visible in the static of the call. "Mom's not well." He paused, waiting for sympathy. When none came, he added, "She had a small stroke. She's home, but what I asked." He exhaled. It's complicated. I just, I think we all said things we didn't mean. Maybe we could start over. The words were careful, dressed in a tone he'd once used when he wanted something big, forgiveness money, a version of me that didn't resist. Start over, I repeated. The phrase felt like a rug laid over a hole in the floor. I can explain more in person, he said quickly. Could we meet somewhere public? Your choice. I looked over at Natalie, who was watching me with raised eyebrows. I covered the microphone with my hand. Coffee shop 2 blocks over, she mouthed. And you're not going alone. I uncovered the mic. Fine, I said. Tomorrow. 11 a.m. The Willow Street Cafe. I ended the call before he could thank me. That night, Natalie and I set ground rules at her kitchen table like we were drafting a constitution. Rule 1, public place midday. Rule 2, no promises, no decisions. Rule 3, if he tries to shift blame, we end the conversation. She listened, nodded, then slid her phone across the table. Record, she said simply. For you. For clarity. I didn't argue. The Willow Street Cafe was warm enough to make my fingers sting as the blood returned. Natalie took a table near the back with a book up like a shield. I chose a seat by the window where the cold light made everything look honest. Michael arrived 5 minutes late, as if tardiness could tilt the power back toward him. He scanned the room, spotted me, and approached with a careful smile. He looked older. Not dramatically, just a touch of gray at the temples that hadn't been there in January, and a heaviness around the eyes that sleep doesn't fix. He sat. For a few seconds, we listened to the hiss of the espresso machine like it were the ocean we'd once promised to visit every summer. How is she? I asked. Recovering, he said. Weak on the left side. The doctors say she'll need help at home for a while. He waited. When I didn't rush into the space with sympathy, he added quickly, I'm hiring in-home care but insurance. It's been a mess. There it was. A hairline crack that led somewhere deeper. A mess how I kept my voice level the way you speak to someone who thinks they're about to sell you something. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folder, the old playbook of papers as credibility. The burst pipe in February. The claim is still pending. They flagged the occupancy status and the joint policy. Your name is still on the homeowners. They need both owners' signatures for some of the disbursements, and the mortgage company wants consent on the temporary refinance. With the medical stuff and the contractor estimates, I could feel the shape of it. Before he finished, the house was a ship taking on water, and the only legal bucket had my name on it. He needed my hand to bail. He slid a page toward me. Photocopies and signatures, arrows where pens should go. If we could sign today, it would... No, I said softly enough that only he could hear the iron in it. We're not signing anything today. He flinched. The mask slipped a fraction. Clara, I thought. You thought I'd walk from the snow into your paperwork, I said. You thought, I'm asking you as your husband, would erase the day you asked me to leave. It doesn't. He closed the folder, hands tightening on the edges. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. It's not just the house. Mom's home care stipend gets better coverage if a family member is listed as the primary caregiver. If you came back even for a while, we could be paid to make my presence bearable, I finished. You want me for signatures and optics, Michael. Not for me. His jaw worked. That's not fair. That's accurate. For a moment, he looked like the man I'd married, a man who hated being cornered by the truth. I'm trying to fix things, he said. I'm sorry for how it happened. Which part? I asked. The part where you let your mother move my life piece by piece into a different room. The part where you turned my marriage into a committee. Or the part where you opened a door to a blizzard and called it space. He swallowed. We were under stress. So was the pipe, I said. It still burst. A silence settled thick and not entirely unkind. Outside the window, a gust lifted old snow into a brief whirl, then let it fall where it pleased. I took a breath. felt for the ground under my feet, and found it solid. "Here are my terms," I said. I watched his eyes narrow wariness, not surprise. "If you need my signature for the claim and any refinance, you'll send the documents to my lawyer. I'll have counsel review, and if they're fair, I'll sign. We do it by the book, notarized copies to both parties, no surprises. Second, we formalize our separation. A written agreement with temporary support and clear possession of the house pending division. Third, communication goes through email. No more midnight pleas. No more dangling emergencies on my voicemail." I leaned back. "If you want me to consider anything beyond that, anything, you'll have to add respect I can read in a contract, not in your voice." He stared at me as if seeing me through new glass. "Since when do you talk like this?" he asked, almost to himself. "Since I thawed," I said. "Turns out I can hear myself again without your mother in the next room." He glanced over my shoulder, then toward the back table where Natalie flipped a page and didn't look up. Something in him seemed to bristle at the sight of an audience, even an accidental one. He lowered his voice. "You don't have to be cruel. And you don't have to pretend this is about love," I replied. "We're negotiating consequences." He nodded once, a tight, functional movement. "I'll email you the documents." "Do," I said. "Send everything." He rose as if to leave, then hesitated. "She asked for you," he added. "Specifically. Said she wanted to talk." I let the weight of that sit. The old reflex, be gracious, be the bigger person, knocked softly at the door and found it locked. "If Evelyn wants to talk, she can call," I said. "I'll decide whether to answer." He left without attempting a hug. The bell over the cafe door chimed, bright and inappropriate. I exhaled, slow and steady, then turned to Natalie, who was already walking toward me. "You were a glacier," she said, sitting down. "Solid cold where you needed to be absolutely immovable." I felt steady, I admitted, like I finally had something underneath me that wasn't shifting. She tapped the table. "You do. Paper." That afternoon, I emailed a legal aid clinic Frank, the retired lawyer from the library, had once mentioned. I didn't ask him to represent me. I didn't need favors and the entanglements they bring. I needed a consultation and a path. By evening, I had an appointment for the next week. Michael's email arrived before dawn. Scans of the insurance claim, the mortgage modification request, the home care paperwork. The subject line read, "For review." No apology in the body. Just links, dates, amounts. It was almost a relief. Numbers don't lie as easily as people do. At 9, my phone rang again. Private number. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, a text. "It's Evelyn." Then answer, "Clara." I didn't want to. I did. Her voice was thinner than I remembered, as if a piece of it had been left behind in a hospital corridor. "I suppose you've heard," she said, skipping greeting, skipping gratitude. "I've heard." "I need you to come home," she said. "Not would you, not could you. I need." I pictured her in that armchair by the window, the basket of yarn never far. I pictured my chair, the chair exiled to the guest room. "That's not my home," I said quietly. She made a sound like she'd tasted something bitter. "Sentimentality is a luxury. Family is duty. Duty without dignity is servitude." I replied, surprised at how easily the sentence came. "I won't return to be your nurse, your maid, and your signature." A beat of silence, then the old steel slid back into place. "You always did think too highly of yourself. And you always thought too little of me," I said. "That's how we got here." Her breath rustled the line. When she spoke again, the veneer cracked. "They're saying the damage downstairs won't be covered unless the forms are completed." "It's thousands, Clara. He's under strain. You don't want that on your conscience." "You threw my conscience into a snowstorm," I said. "It found better shelter." She hissed something I couldn't catch and ended the call without goodbye. I stared at the phone a long time after the line went flat, then saved the voicemail to a folder named Record. That evening, I printed everything Michael had sent and put the stack in a clean white folder. I labeled the spine with a date. It felt like labeling a box before a move, not the past packed away, but the present organized for transport. Outside, the last of the old snow had turned to a gray crust along the curb. The forecast promised another cold snap, maybe flurries by the weekend. I made tea, sat by the window of Natalie's apartment, and looked at the city rooftops the way they held the light. When I finally slept, I dreamed of keys. Not the one that used to open the door to the house I left, but a new key, cool and exact in my palm, one that fit a lock I hadn't found yet, but knew I would. Morning would bring the legal consult. After that, signatures lines, boundaries on paper that could not be rearranged like sweaters in a drawer. And then, when everything was in its right place, there would be one last conversation, my conversation on my terms. Not an apology, not a plea, a choice. And I already knew which warmth I would choose. The legal consultation was in a small plain office tucked above a bakery. The smell of fresh bread drifted up the stairwell, a strange comfort for the conversation we were about to have. My attorney, a brisk, steady woman named Marisol, flipped through the folder I'd brought like she'd been expecting it for weeks. When she looked up, her expression was matter of fact. "You have leverage," she said. "Your name is still on the deed and the mortgage. The insurance claim can't proceed without your consent. You also have potential grounds for a formal separation with spousal support, given the financial restrictions you were under before you left. If we file now, you can make your cooperation with the claim contingent on fair terms for yourself." The word contingent stuck with me all day. It felt clean, powerful. This wasn't revenge for the sake of it. It was making the terms of my involvement my own. That afternoon, I emailed Michael. The message was short. "My lawyer will be in touch. All documents and communications go through her from now on. No greeting. No sign-off. Just business." 2 days later, Marisol forwarded me his reply. He'd agreed to the arrangement, probably because he knew the insurance money would keep bleeding away with every week of delay. Over the next 3 weeks, everything moved with surprising speed. Marisol negotiated a written separation agreement that gave me a modest monthly stipend, full release from any liability on the house after the insurance claim closed, and the part that made me smile, a clause acknowledging that certain items in the house were my personal property to be returned. My reading chair was on the list. So was the quilt my grandmother had made. Michael didn't fight most of it. Maybe Evelyn's condition left him without the energy. Maybe he just wanted this chapter over. Either way, by the time the papers were ready to sign, the balance had shifted entirely. We met at Marisol's office. He arrived alone, folder under his arm, looking thinner than I remembered. I didn't offer to shake his hand, and he didn't offer either. We sat across from each other at the long wooden table, the separation agreement laid out between us. Marisol guided us through each page. Michael signed first, his handwriting smaller than I remembered, like he was trying to take up less space. When it was my turn, I signed with slow, deliberate strokes, each pen movement a quiet reclaiming. When the last page was done, Marisol gathered the papers and excused herself to make copies. The room felt strangely hollow without her. Michael cleared his throat. "You really won't even visit? Mom's been asking." I looked at him for a long moment. "The day you locked that door, you made sure this was no longer my home. There's nothing for me to visit." He glanced down, nodding once as if that was the answer he'd expected but still hoped not to hear. "She's not the same since the stroke." "Neither am I said. We didn't speak again before Marisol returned with the copies. She handed each of us a neat stack, then stood until we'd both left the building. Outside, the air was sharp but clear, the last patches of snow receding into gutters. Michael walked toward the parking lot without looking back. I turned the other way. The first thing I did was go to a small moving company and arrange for the pickup of my listed belongings. The delivery was scheduled for the following week. When the day came, two men in blue uniforms carried my chair and quilt into the apartment I'd just rented on my own. It was small with creaky floors and paint that needed refreshing, but it was mine, the lease in my name alone. I placed the chair by the window, draped the quilt over its back, and sat down. Sunlight poured through the glass, warming my hands. I realized I hadn't sat in this chair since before Evelyn moved in. It felt like a piece of myself had been returned. That night, I made tea and stood at the window looking out at the streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. My phone buzzed a text from an unknown number. "I hope you're happy," it read. I deleted it without replying. Because I was. Not wildly, not in the way stories promise after escape, but in a quieter, steadier way. I had warmth that didn't depend on someone else's permission. I had income that didn't come with conditions. I had space that no one else could rearrange to their liking. The coldest day of my life had forced me out into a storm I wasn't ready for, but it also pushed me far enough away to see the truth I'd been living in the frost long before the snow fell. And now I was thawing. To everyone listening, if you've ever been pushed out of a place that was supposed to be yours, know this: the place doesn't define you. The people who tried to make you small don't decide how big you can grow. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had to rebuild from nothing? What was the first thing you claimed as yours again? And if this story stayed with you, subscribe to Grace's Truth for more stories like this. Because sometimes the warmest revenge is simply living where their cold can't reach you.